The prairie stretched endlessly under the high sun, a sea of golden wheat whispering with every breath of wind. Brian rode slowly, the hooves of his horse, Solace, drumming a rhythmic echo against the dry earth. Dust swirled in lazy eddies around him, rising and falling as though the land itself were breathing. He had known the solitude of these plains for years, had come to find comfort in the vast emptiness, the kind that kept questions at bay and memories locked deep within his chest. Yet today, even the familiar scent of dust and sun-baked grass could not quiet the weight pressing against his ribs. It was a heaviness born not of loneliness alone, but of a promise he had not yet made to himself, the promise that he would still find the courage to care, to protect, and perhaps to love again. Ahead, a small homestead rose like a solitary sentinel amid the endless fields. The wooden boards were weathered by decades of sun and storm, and the paint had long surrendered to the raw honesty of bare timber. A porch leaned slightly to one side, its steps worn smooth by the passage of many feet. Brian slowed Solace to a careful walk, sensing instinctively the tension that lay in the air, a quiet tremor of life, waiting to be disturbed. Then, from the shade of the porch, two small figures appeared. Children, eyes wide and wary, their little bodies poised with the instinctive caution of those who have learned fear too early. "Are you here to hurt our mama too?" the little girl demanded, her voice high-pitched with a mixture of fear and fierce defiance. She was small, no more than 4, with tangled hair that caught the sunlight in reddish-gold strands, and eyes like dark pools reflecting both curiosity and suspicion. Her brother, only 6, but already carrying the gravity of a lifetime of worries in the crease of his forehead, stood protectively beside her. His tiny fists clutched the edge of a blanket, knuckles white, eyes darting to the man who had suddenly intruded upon their fragile world. Brian dismounted slowly, letting the reins fall slack over Solace's neck. His movements were deliberate, careful not to startle them further. "I wouldn't hurt your mama," he said softly, his voice low and calm, carrying the authority of experience, but the gentleness of a man who had learned to tread lightly upon others' hearts. His eyes, a deep, steady brown, met theirs with patience, and in the silence that followed, a fragile bridge began to form, though neither side crossed it fully yet. The children's mother, Emma, appeared then, leaning weakly against the doorframe. She was pale, her hair pulled back loosely, her frame small but resolute despite the visible toll her illness had taken. Her eyes widened in wary recognition of Brian, and something flickered there, memory, hope, fear, all tangled into one fragile thread. The children's question had been posed not out of curiosity alone, but from the instinctive awareness that adults carried the power to either protect or destroy. Brian took a step closer, slow, measured. "I only came because I heard she needed help," he said. "I'm Brian. I ride alone, but I know how to take care of people." The words were simple, yet they carried a weight of sincerity, the kind that cannot be feigned. He reached out a hand, not in command, but in invitation. Arya and Neil hesitated, measuring his intent with the instinctive caution that comes from children who have learned to survive in a world of whispered judgments and quiet dangers. After a heartbeat that stretched too long, the little girl stepped slightly forward, the edge of her bravery glinting in the sunlight. Brian bent to her level, his eyes gentle. "Your mama. She doesn't have to face this alone. I can help." Neil's small hand tugged at Arya's sleeve, a silent question, and she nodded minutely, the decision made in unspoken solidarity. Over the following days, Brian's presence became a quiet, stabilizing force. He helped with chores, mended fences, fetched water, and tended to the little injuries that came with childhood play. Each act was small, deliberate, and without expectation. Emma watched him from the doorway, her chest rising and falling with a rhythm of cautious admiration. She noticed the way he adjusted the straps on Solace's saddle with careful precision, the way he let the children's laughter ring without interruption, the way his eyes softened when Arya pressed a sticky hand against his weathered palm. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic declarations, only the slow accumulation of trust, built from action rather than words. Brian's own heart began to stir in a way it hadn't in years. He had been a man of solitude, of long rides under endless skies, of nights by campfires with only the whispering wind for company. Yet here, among this fragile family, he felt the stirrings of something new, a desire not only to protect but to belong, to matter in ways beyond the passing of seasons and the turning of days. The children noticed, too, their initial wariness giving way to the purest form of trust, the kind that can only be earned by consistency, kindness, and quiet courage. Emma's illness, however, remained an unyielding shadow over this fledgling connection. On a particularly hot afternoon, when the sun burned high and the prairie shimmered with heat, she stumbled while carrying a basket of freshly washed clothes. Brian was there instantly, catching her gently, supporting her weight as if she were the most fragile vessel. Her face flushed with embarrassment, but he would not allow her shame to linger. "You're stronger than you think," he murmured, his voice a balm against the sting of her insecurity. But even strong people need help sometimes. It was during these quiet moments that their connection deepened. Brian learned the rhythm of her breaths, the subtle flicker of expression that betrayed worry or fatigue, the way her fingers trembled slightly when she held the children close. Emma, in turn, began to recognize the constancy in him, the patience that did not demand, the attention that did not pry. Their conversations were sparse but weighted, each word chosen with care, each silence filled with mutual understanding. Days blended into one another with a steady cadence of small gestures, shared chores, and stolen glances. Brian would repair a fence while watching the children run through the tall grass, their laughter carrying on the wind. He would fetch water while Emma rested, offering a handkerchief or a gentle touch on her arm. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, an intimacy grew, a tapestry woven from patience, quiet heroism, and unspoken longing. The town's judgmental whispers lingered at the edges of their lives, but inside the homestead, a small sanctuary had formed, where care and connection outweighed suspicion and rumor. Then came the day when Emma's strength faltered more than usual. She fainted while trying to tend to the children's midday meal, her body collapsing softly onto the floor. Brian caught her with ease born of practiced strength, lowering her to a shaded corner where the sun could not burn her fragile skin. Arya and Neil cried out, fear sharpening their tiny voices, and Brian knelt beside them, holding Emma's hand with a gentleness that belied the urgency in his movements. He whispered to her, steadying her breathing, coaxing her back from a brink, his heart pounding not from exertion, but from the fierce protective instinct that had taken root deep within him. In that moment, the unspoken became undeniable. The lines between duty, compassion, and desire blurred. Emma looked into Brian's eyes and saw not only a protector, but a man who could hold her heart with care, who could honor her fragility without diminishing her strength. Brian saw in her the embodiment of resilience, courage, and the kind of beauty that transcends the physical, touching the soul with quiet force. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the prairie in golds and ambers, Brian found himself unable to contain the words any longer. "Emma," he said softly, the wind carrying his voice across the porch and the wheat beyond. She turned to him, eyes wide, chest heaving slightly from the strain of the day. I've been trying not to feel this, to stay steady and distant, but I can't. Not anymore. I care for you. More than I've ever cared for anyone. I don't want to just help you. I want to be with you. Always." The world seemed to pause, the prairie holding its breath, the children frozen in the moment, Arya clutching Neil's hand as they waited for her response. Emma's lips trembled with the weight of unshed tears, and then a smile, a slow, trembling smile that held fear, hope, and longing all at once, broke across her face. "Brian, I've been waiting for you to say that," she whispered. Her hand found his, intertwining fingers with the hesitancy of someone learning to trust fully after years of self-preservation. Arya and Neil cheered quietly, their tiny voices filled with joy, wrapping the adults in a cocoon of familial warmth. Brian knelt to embrace them, before forming a tableau of new beginnings against the golden backdrop of prairie light. In the quiet that followed, words were unnecessary. A brush of hair, a squeeze of a hand, a shared glance, all spoke volumes. And then, with a courage that mirrored the quiet heroism of the plains themselves, Brian asked the question that had lingered in his heart since the first day he stepped onto the homestead. Will you marry me? Emma's eyes glistened with tears, the weight of fear, hope, and love pressing against her chest. Yes, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The engagement was quiet, tender, and deeply intimate, witnessed only by the children and the vast, sunlit prairie that had borne witness to countless stories of struggle and endurance. Evening fell softly, the sky painted in strokes of orange and pink, the air thick with the scent of wild grass, and the warmth of a sun slowly retiring beyond the horizon. Brian stood beside Emma on the porch, watching as the children played in the fading light, their laughter carrying like wind chimes across the empty fields. The world seemed right, though fragile, balanced delicately between the hardships endured and the promise of joy. In that moment, Brian reflected on the long road that had brought him here, the solitude, the loss, the whispered judgments of a town that had long misunderstood him. Yet every hardship had led to this, a family forged in quiet resilience, love built in gestures rather than declarations, and the deep, unspoken knowledge that they were stronger together. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, a reminder that life is vast, unpredictable, and yet, for those who dare to open their hearts, full of grace and possibility. And to you, who stand on the edge of your own story, know this: love is not always loud or swift. It grows in patience, in small acts of courage, in the moments where you choose kindness over fear. It is found in the quiet gestures, the shared silences, the steadfast presence of one soul beside another. Even in a world full of judgment, of hardship, of uncertainty, the heart that dares to trust, to protect, to care, will find its home. And sometimes that home is not a place, but a person, waiting patiently in the sunlit fields, ready to welcome you with open hands and a heart that knows your worth.